Hello again, 201. To conclude Chapter 8, Europe, I'll go over some of the economic and geopolitical considerations and characteristics and topics of this particular region of the world. And there's some excellent economic topics in this chapter, ladies and gentlemen. The Industrial Revolution began in Europe. The common market grew out of post-World War II events, and we'll talk some about that. And the euro is trying to hang on in the 21st century, but in the last 10 years they've had a lot of problems with that common currency. There were two big changes in the Industrial Revolution. Machines replaced human labor in manufacturing, and inanimate energy sources powered the new machines. And this occurred in England first in the 18th century through the mid-19th century. The center of change was the textile industry located near the Pennine Mountains, and by 1730 there were mechanized looms, all these different inventions of English inventors like John Kay and Edmund Cartwright and James Hargreaves with the spinning jenny, and that took away handmade clothing, and they began to manufacture textiles and clothing items using machines. Originally steam, and then because England had a lot of coal, when the steam engine was able to use this instead of water, they began to locate factories in different areas, and you didn't necessarily have to be made near some kind of rural forest where they could make charcoal to turn it into coke in the iron making process. They were able to move these things away from those particular natural resources and rely more on coal. And that's where England was the leader in coal and iron during the first Industrial Revolution. Again, it begins in textiles, moves into steam power, and then coal, and finally iron making. And then they built a rail industry, and that spread all over Europe then eventually. And the industrial landscape is what a lot of England had in that particular time period of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Not 17th, in the 18th century into the 19th century, it became a very, very industrialized region. In France, it was this particular, the Meuse and Sambre region, and that's on the border of France, became a heavy industrial area. Liège, Belgium. The Saar-Lorraine region of northwest Germany. Alsace-Lorraine were two provinces that France and Germany have warred over a few times in the last 150 years. Silesia in southwest Poland is another rich resource area. It was originally part of Prussia, and again, that's why the Poles have been pulled back and forth by the Germans and the Russians on both sides of them. They want these natural resources that are in that particular region of Europe. Northern Italy embraced hydroelectric power because it's near the Alps, and Milan was the first city with electric lights, ironically enough, in 1883. In the post-World War II era, the Marshall Plan was the economic revitalization that the United States wanted Western Europe to go through, mainly to keep them from becoming communist. And the Stalinists called this bourgeois imperialism, but they were offered the same aid, but the Eastern Europeans rejected it because Stalin would not let them take advantage. And that retarded their progress and their recovery from the devastation of the Second World War. In the 1950s, cooperative economic groups, this was the first one, the coal and steel community. And later in the 50s, the Common Market, or the EEC, the European Economic Cooperation Group, or the European Common Market, supported the free movement of goods, labor, and capitals across borders. This is the beginning of the neoliberal movement. Great Britain always wants to go their own way because they still had the Commonwealth going on, and France also objected to membership because they don't want to deal with other groups that historically they wanted to try to dominate. And in 1973, Britain finally got on board, and some other countries. And finally, in the 90s, it became the European Union. And that's basically where they're at today. And all of these former Soviet bloc countries have also joined into the EU. If you want more information on this, there's wonderful graphics in the textbook that illustrate this quite well. The euro was created in 1999. And since 2002, they've been available euro coins and bills for everyday use. And when you're traveling, this greatly eases the process of being able to buy and exchange goods and services wherever you go. Unfortunately, there are countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy that have had financial crises that the more well-off European Union members like Germany have forced them to make loans and other financial considerations in order to deal with these economic downturns in these countries. They basically have debt from too many people being retired and not enough people working. It's upside down. Will this continue? Will the wealthier countries continue to redistribute wealth in order to prop these other not so functioning well economies? We'll see. The Soviet plan was about command economy. That was the big alternative during the Cold War, where all economic, political, and social decisions are centrally planned and controlled. This command style system is in disfavor in 2018. It's inefficient. It cannot react to changing market conditions at the moment because this is all done based on previous information from previous years. And that's the problem with the economic field, ladies and gentlemen. Economists are always dealing with old information. And because of that, if you're trying to centrally plan something and to collectivize something, you're using outdated information. That's the power and the strength of the capitalist system, is that it adjusts on the go to changing demand. And goods then flow where they have to go in order to meet that changing demand at the moment. You can't do that in a centrally planned economy. You have to get the bureaucracy to okay it, and that takes time. That's red tape. But they did have success in modernizing with collectivization and central planning. It was brutally done. If you objected, you were eliminated. In Poland and many parts of the old Yugoslavia, which is 7 countries today, they did not favor this system whatsoever. These particular Eastern Bloc countries were almost completely collectivized. As I mentioned, this creates shortages because they produce a certain amount in a month. And when it's gone, it could be after a week, it could be after 2 weeks, it could be after 3 weeks. It's not going to be replaced until the following month. And that's why people stood in line for toilet paper and other things we take for granted in the West. And again, one of the neoliberal points of view of globalization is that privatization describes a better economic system, and Eastern Europe has embraced that today. The geopolitical modern factors, there was the Cold War after the World War II, and then the Yugoslavia breakup in the 90s, and then the ethnic conflicts that resulted in the powder keg of Europe, as it was once called, in the Balkans. During these years, the continent was divided by the Iron Curtain into East and West. East, command, communist; West, capitalist, democratic. And at Yalta, it was demanded of the Soviet leader Stalin that free elections be allowed. That never happened. Anywhere the Red Army tanks rolled, they did not come out until the end of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And They did this in order to create a buffer zone. They did not want to be invaded again. They had been invaded 3 different times by Napoleon, by the Germans in the First World War, and again in the Second World War, and they have a long memory of history, and they wanted to prevent that from ever occurring again. And eventually, after the war was over, these are the areas controlled by the Soviets. And then Germany and Austria were divided, with the Allies controlling a sector. And Berlin, the city of the Cold War, was also divided by these 4 victorious powers of World War II. And out of that, in the late 40s, 2 hostile ideologies faced off: NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And they faced each other with weapons for decades. They tried starving Berlin out in the blockade. They basically airlifted everything in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it saved the city. And eventually they stopped the blockade. My father had to stay in Germany when the Berlin Wall was built. That's why I'm here. He stayed another year in Germany with Mom. And concrete and barbed wire barrier across this tried to prevent people from leaving the Eastern Bloc countries. And in 1989, it was torn down. I'd like to have a piece of that wall. That would be pretty cool. All the satellites went independent finally. A couple of big areas. Hungary in 56, that revolution was crushed, as it was in the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. That's the Brezhnev Doctrine. And that's where the Arab Spring got its name in 2011. And as I mentioned, the powder keg is now back to what it was before World War I. This area is a mishmash of many events of world history. Take a look at that figure in Chapter 8. It's well worth it. All of the different influences in that area that we talked about: language, culture, and religion, and all the different nations then that were carved out of those different languages and cultures and religions. Balkanization is another geopolitical term, which means that things get splintered and developed into small-scale independence movements, because many of these areas were very small areas, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, very tiny places, but very distinct, and they don't want to be part of any other country. Montenegro, Macedonia, Kosovo, and the Serbs tried to genocide the Muslims in Kosovo. And this is some more history here. If you're interested in reading that, you can. This is very recent Balkan history and why it developed the way it did. Marshal Tito was a strong-handed socialist ruler, and Stalin did not try to crush what he was doing. He invented the term socialism in 2 countries to describe what Tito was trying to do. And after he passed away, he passed away in 1980, and after that, it basically starts to come unraveled until the huge problems of the late 1990s and what the Serbs were trying to do in Bosnia and in Kosovo. And that gave NATO another reason for existence. It was wondered, was NATO going to go away after the fall of the Soviet Union? They're still in the Balkans today, keeping the peace. And Miroslav Milosevic was eventually charged with war crimes, but he died in prison before he ever went to trial. And here are some of the global problems that are in the Balkans today. And these countries have very, very keen interests in this particular region of the world. And that's about it, really, for the geopolitics of Europe and for Chapter 8.